Welcome back to Let's Make a Game, a channel about making computer role-playing games using the free program Twine and the Sugarcube format for Twine. In this video, I would like to continue talking about my project of adapting the fighting fantasy rules to a Twine game using the Sword and Planet subgenre of science fiction to inspire the setting and the plot. So we have the start of the program. If you've been following this series, you'll see that this is all new. Previously, you were randomly given a character. Now we have these 4 buttons, which each of which lets us pick a particular character. So it's got sort of text on the background story of the character to indicate who's who, or at least it will indicate who's who once you get used to it. Of course, when you're new, this won't sort of tell you what sort of character you get. Or we can choose a random character. So if we click on that, we'll get one of those 4. So let's click the random character one, and we can see that it gave us the character that is desperate for money. And you might have noticed that the buttons look slightly different. They have rounded corners rather than sort of pointy square corners, which I think looks slightly better. Obviously it's subjective, but I think it looks a bit better, and I'll tell you how I did that when we get to that, get to look at the code. If we continue, we can see that we have the text that we had before, but then we have this new text, and we can see that instead of sort of fully writing out what's happening in a sort of final version, as we've done up here, it's just a sort of description of, it's just a sort of summary of what happens. You see the hunter-gatherers, rather than having a paragraph of you hear these figures coming, and they are, tall, and they're blue, and etc. etc. We have just a summary, and so too in the buttons we can reveal self or stay hidden. Again, that wouldn't be, obviously there'd be more text in a finished game, and if we reveal self, it continues in that form. It says in brackets, taken to village, see pit, argument. And then we have the option jump in pit or wait. And whichever one we choose, we see a new sort of attribute come up. If we choose to, let's go back. If we choose to jump in the pit, we get respect 3. And if we choose to wait, we get respect 1. Jumping in the pit is better from that point of view, but there will be, at least when more is coded, there will be disadvantages of taking that option as well. So, what is happening here? Why have I chosen to do it this way? Why have I chosen to have this text in brackets? Let's deal with that first. Well, the reason is because I often think of what's going to happen, and I can think about how that's going to happen in terms of the way the different sections relate to each other before I think about the exact wording of how to express it. So I thought of the idea, and we were going through my notes in the last video. I thought of the idea of, you see the hunter-gatherers, you are taken to their village, or at least you're taken to their village if you reveal yourself. I suppose if they were hunter-gatherers, it wouldn't be a village, actually, so that's inaccurate. It would be a temporary camp, but, anyway. I mean, a visitor from Earth might well call it a village. You're not meant to be, none of the characters are sort of anthropologists or anything anyway, so I'm probably being a bit more pedantic than the genre really, would generally be. But anyway, you're taken to their village. I have the idea that you're taken to the village, you see a sort of pit that's been dug out, and you determine that it's for some sort of combat, and there's an argument about whether to. There's an argument which, of course, you can't understand the language, but you guess correctly that they're arguing about whether you should be subjected to this ritual. And if you jump in the pit, they have more respect for you because you're sort of, in their minds, you're indicating that you're willing to be treated as important enough to have to go through this ritual with the attendant dangers, whereas if you wait, they'll have a sort of lower respect for you. So I thought of all that, and I thought of some other mechanics which I haven't yet coded, that if you jump in the pit, what will happen is that you'll test your luck, and if you're lucky, you won't have to deal with the combat. If you are unlucky, you will have to deal with the combat, and then things will proceed from there. I generally think of the structure of these encounters before I think about how to turn it into this sort of prose, how to turn it into the kind of final prose. And of course, sometimes when I'm sort of writing it out, it becomes obvious that, well, actually, this branching is probably a bit pointless, or I can't think of a way to distinguish these two different choices mechanically, so I'm just going to not have that choice. I'll have it automatically that you do one of the two things, something like that. So if I had written things out fully, if I'd written things out in this way, I would end up sort of wasting a lot of work, because I would end up writing the full version of a paragraph that didn't end up being used, or ended up being used in a different form, being merged with something else or something like that. So what I've chosen to do is just put notes in brackets. So instead of trying to write out the encounter in detail, I just put what happens in this scene or this part of the story. Well, in this one, you see the hunter-gatherers. That's the essential sort of plot of the story. And your essential choices, I can sort of think of the wording later, but you will have the choice to reveal yourself or to stay hidden. And to indicate to myself that these are incomplete, so that I don't forget and end up thinking I've finished when I haven't, I put them in brackets. So that's just a sort of a code that I've invented for myself. If something is in brackets, then that is not the final version. It is, I mean, not that anything's ever the final version, because you can always have new ideas, but it's definitely not the final version. It's just a description of what should go in that particular place. See hunter-gatherers in brackets basically means at some point you're going to need to write a few sentences that describe your encounter with these aliens and what they look like and so on. And then, of course, sometimes the inspiration will take me, and I'll, want to kind of write out the full version. But normally, I find that I think of the structure before I think of the exact way to express that structure, to describe what's happening. Once again, that's not the only way to do it, and it's not necessarily the best way to do it. It's a way to do it. It's the way that I do it. I'm not sort of trying to prescribe that you have to do it this way. But if you, if you're sort of at a loss and you don't know exactly what to do at all, well, here's a way to do it. And you can if you can't think of any way to do it, you can sort of do it my way until you sort of work out what's a better way for you. So that is sort of what I've added. As usual, I'd like to spend the rest of the video describing how I did it. So let's look at the code. So there's a lot of little... Sorry, just trying to expand this. There we go. I was waiting for the arrow to change to something else. In most programs, it changes to something else to indicate that you can drag the sides of it, but it seems like it doesn't do it in this one, which I hadn't realised until just then. So we've got the combat system, which we talked about before, but which we haven't yet used in this version of the program, and that's over here because we haven't yet. We're definitely going to need it, of course, because you can't have a fighting fantasy without the fighting, I guess. We've got the story caption, which is the sidebar, and then we've got over here, to make it a bit easier to see sort of which one we're working on, we've got the main story, and we're mostly dealing with these paragraphs today, and there's a little bit of stuff to do with the caption. So let's zoom in a little bit to make it easier, and let's start with, there's no particular order here, but let's start with talking about the rounded corners. The buttons have rounded corners instead of the default sort of square corners, 90-degree corners. I will be going over some stuff that I've already talked about in previous videos, but I have a fair number of new subscribers, so I feel like it's probably a good idea to repeat myself, just in case those people haven't gone back and found that particular video. I mean, I have made a lot of videos, so it's sort of easy to miss. So I'm sorry if this is, I mean, it is something I've talked about. I'm sorry if it's something that you go, oh yeah, I remember that. But it's sort of, I think, necessary to kind of catch everyone up. So this is in the style sheet, and it's very simple. It's this bit of code here. This bit of code, by the way, is by default in the sidebar. At the top of the sidebar, by default, it will display the file name, which in this case is FF, for now, until I come up with a better name. And I didn't want to do that. I wanted to have the logo instead, and I might want to have a sort of special logo version of the title once I think of a title. Instead, I didn't want to have the sort of plain, it's in this sort of similar, I don't know if it's exactly the same font, but it's in this sort of very plain font, like the fonts of the heading of the page, and I didn't want to do that. I wanted either nothing or something fancier, so that's what that code is. But anyway, this code is, there are several ways you can alter the appearance of buttons. The relevant one is, the corner is border radius. It's not terribly instinctive to me. Why would you call rounding the corners? I would think you'd call it corner or rounding or something like that. But anyway, they've gone with border radius. So you go, as with any other style sheet stuff, you have the sort of heading, which in this case is BUTTON, button, space, curly brackets, and then whatever you want to do inside that topic of the button. And each of the different things, if you do more than one thing, each one should end with a semicolon, other than the last one. Like, you use a semicolon to separate the different commands. You don't need to have a semicolon when you have only one, but I generally put it in just because it's easier to put it in every time, easier to remember. And then you have an end curly bracket when an end curly bracket when you're finished, and you go border radius, BORDER dash RADIUS colon space, and then I've put 8 pixels. Obviously, the more pixels I can put, greater or lesser amounts of pixels if I wanted to, and that would make the round bit bigger. Basically, if I did it big enough, the button would become a sort of more or less an oval, which would look a bit silly. But I just went with 8px as being the one that looks best. You can also do percentages, thus, or again, whatever percentage you want. But I wanted the corner to be the same size on each button, not for there to be more rounding when it was a wider button. That looked a bit, it didn't look, it looked a bit sort of messy and I'm not sure, a bit rough to me. So I went with a number of pixels. So you can, that's what PX is, a sort of standard abbreviation for pixels. So you can specify a number of pixels, or you can specify a percentage thus. But if you specify a percentage, the amount of rounding, the size of the corner, will of course be different on each button, and I found that not particularly desirable. So that's how the rounded corners are done. Let's look at the extra. Actually, no, I won't do that. It would make more sense to look at something that isn't visible in what you saw. What's happening is that I'm displaying the sections. I'm dividing the sections in a different way to the default, in a different way to the way that Twine was designed to do. Twine is designed where every page, every one of these little squares, should be by default its own section. So you should have something like, let's say we have a passage here, and we might say you may go left or right, and then we might have a button or just a link that takes us to the left passage, and another one that's going to the right passage, and maybe another one that's another action like light up a torch or cast a spell or something like that. And so then we'd make another passage which is left passage, and then we'd have you go down the left passage and come to a door, and then the door we'd have a number of choices here. Try to pick the lock, cast a spell to open the door, try to kick the door down, ignore the door and continue on, change your mind and go back to the previous passage, etc., etc. And each of those would lead to a new page. So each section of the how do I get rid of this? Here we go, delete. What in a game book would be a section would be in Twine a page. And it makes it very easy to do that. I have chosen to do it in a sort of much more complicated and difficult way. And I've done that for a good reason. The complicated and difficult way, I've mentioned it before, but basically we have an array which is all of the different sections. And I've created that array since making the last video. The very beginning of the game doesn't work like this, but I've sort of started now. So you have $S, or whatever you choose to call it. I've chosen to call it $S for sections, and then we write data into all of the different slots that we're going to use. Each slot of the array is a section, and it can have a number, as in this one, or it can have a text description, as in 1A, 1B, 1C. We could have longer text descriptions. In the example that I was just doing, we could have set S junction, something like that. That's probably not a very good example because there's probably going to be lots and lots of different junctions if it was a fairly big game, but we could have section junction, and then we put the data that is related to that section, which is firstly some text, or it is the phrase no text to indicate that there isn't any text. We could also do an empty string, so just two quotes like that, but I chose to do no text. Or we have unwritten, which is when we, well, it's what you'd think. It's when I haven't gotten up to coding that bit yet. Instead of generating an error as it tries to find a slot that doesn't exist in the array, We instead say, well, we'll set it up as unwritten and then we'll fill it in later. So we have the text. Then, if it's not one of these unwritten ones, we have a number which indicates what sort of paragraph it is mechanically. And what I mean by that is it could be the end of the story, and I've given that the number 0. It could be that we continue to one other section without a choice, so we present some text and then move immediately to a different section. I've called that 1. It could be a player choice. I've called that 2, and etc. etc. It could be a fight. It could be a die roll. It could be specific things to do with this system that we're using. So because it's fighting fantasy, we will probably have testing your luck, testing your skill, and testing your stamina, because those are all things that are sort of standard randomization in the fighting fantasy series, and they'd all have their different numbers. And then the data after that, what that means depends on this number. So if it's 0, there's no other data. It just means you've lost. If it's 1, which is moved to another section, then the next bit of data is what section you move to. If it's 2, which is a player choice, it's a bit more complicated because you have to say how many choices there are. And then for each choice, you have to have the text that'll appear on the button and the destination. For testing your luck, you'd probably have where do you go if you're lucky, and then where do you go if you're unlucky. For a combat, you'd probably have how many opponents are there, and then for each opponent, you'd probably have their name, skill, and stamina. And then at the end, you'd probably have, or maybe you'd have this at the beginning, but either way, somewhere you'd have to have where you go if you win. And then if we had a section that said get an item, we'd say we'd probably have some data about which item you get, and so on and so on. So why, before I show you how that works in a bit more detail, why do that? Well, why go to all this trouble to sort of almost rewrite a thing that just does what Twine is built to do anyway? Well, the reason is because if we do it this way, we can test the game a lot more easily, because we can set up a system where we randomize a character and then make random choices and keep track of how often the player succeeds or fails for each, in this case, for each option, for each character option. So we might want to say, go through this 400 times, 100 times with character 1, 100 times with character 2, and so on, and keep track of the wins and losses in each, for each one, and then give us those figures. And we might find that the game is just too hard for every character. So we might find, for example, let's say that it tells us that character 1 died 98 times and won twice. If that's not the balance that we want, we might go, well, that's fine. That is what I want. I want people to fail 49 times before they succeed. But we might say, no, that's too hard. I want them to get through 10% of the time or something like that. And so that would, if we got similar results for all of the characters, we'd know that the game was a bit hard in general. Conversely, of course, we might find that it's too easy. If we find that, well, these characters are getting through sort of 50 or 60 times and dying sort of 50 or 40 times, we might say, well, that's not what I want either. I need to make it a bit harder. So I'll add some more stuff, or I'll make the penalties of particular things more severe, and we'll see what happens. We also might see differences between characters. We might go, well, character 1, 3, and 4, they got through sort of 3, 4, and 5 times, and that's about right. But character 2 is getting through only once, or character 2 has gotten through 20 times or something like that. And so we know that it's the advantage, or that the character that character 2 has is too good, or conversely it's not good enough, or the disadvantage is too high. So we need to we would need to change the game with that in mind. We'd need to say, well, what's a thing we can do where character 2 would be better off, and we can think about what we have in the game and say, oh, well, this encounter, character 2 is meant to be good at, such and such, so therefore that could be an opportunity for them to be able to bypass what would otherwise be a danger. So it allows us to test it fairly quickly. We can sort of set it, run the program, and a few minutes later at the latest, we'll get the results of 400 simulated games. Whereas playing the thing 400 times would be really, really time consuming. So that's the reason why we are doing this very long-winded way of kind of repeating what Twine already does. We're doing it in an array because it's easier to test. There's no way to automatically test a Twine game that I know of, or at least if there is, it would require complicated JavaScript that is probably beyond me, and this is probably easier to do anyway. So that's why we're doing it. Let's have a look at how we do it. Let's have a look at how it works. So we've seen choosing the character. I might just briefly show you the way that the random one works. So we have a button. This is the first character option. We have a button. The text is, the money the scientist offered was good, ... The destination is intro 1. And the code that executes if we press this button, if the player presses this button, is we set $CH to 1. $CH being the variable that keeps track of which character we've chosen. And then there's similar ones for character 2, character 3, and character 4. And character 4. The random one is pretty straightforward. We set Z equal to random 1 to 4. So it's it effectively chooses one of the characters. And then we print this text, which will be something like this. Button, choose a random character, intro, and then plus Z. So let's say we pick 3, intro 3, set CH equals, and then we press Z again. So let's say 3 again. So if this one's different, if it's intro 2 instead, well, this will also change to be compatible with it. That's why we don't have random 1 to 4 there and random 1 to 4 there. We set Z equal to random 1 to 4, and then we put Z into this string that we're printing, so that the page that you go to is consistent with the character option. So it will print something like that, but of course you won't know, you the player won't know whether you're going to intro 1, 2, 3 or 4 and what CH is going to be set to. All right, so each of these, I won't show you all 4 because they're very, very similar. We have a button, the text is continue, the destination is main, which is this one. It's called that because most of the program is going to be looping around this page. It'll kind of go off to little sub pages. We will be making a lot more pages, but it'll be mostly just sort of looping around to this page until either the player wins or loses or abandons the game. So we have a button, continue, goes to main, set $C equal 1. Don't get $C and $CH confused. $C tells us that we can now start printing the character in the sidebar. And then of course we have /button to close off the button. So once we're in, and the other pages, the intro 1, 2, and 3 are exactly the same, or except that of course this text is different, but this code at the bottom will be exactly the same. So we have $A, that's a new variable, and it is given a value of 1 at the in the initialize page. So we set A equal to 1, and that just means that you start on paragraph 1. We could have gone with start or something like that, but I just went with the number 1 just because that's what I'm used to from reading game books. We don't have to use numbers. In fact, I often I like to have more to sort of number things in such a way as that related paragraphs maybe have the same number but different text after them. That's why I've got 1A, 1B, and 1C and stuff. I sort of find it easier to see what's going on that way. Whereas, of course, in a game book, you want the numbers to be all over the place. You might start at 1, but then the choices will take you to 15 and 212, something like that. And of course, you do that so that you don't accidentally see the stuff that's related to where you are and get information that you shouldn't have. Well, we're doing this on a computer, so we don't have that particular necessity, and therefore we can have 1 going to 1A and 1B, and choices that go choice 2 sends you to choice 3 and choice 4 or whatever, because the player's never going to see those numbers. They're just for internal use within the program anyway. So we might as well set it to 1. So we look at $S. $S is a 2-dimensional array. The first slot being the current section, which is encoded in $A. I suppose $A stands for $at, I guess. I would sort of instinctively maybe use $S, but I've already used $S for this array, so it is a little bit arbitrary. But just remember that $A is which section you're currently at, which section you, the player, are currently at, which starts at 1, and $S is the array that sort of has all the information. It's sort of the game book in the form of a 2-dimensional array, I suppose. So we look at $S, $A, 0, which is where the text is. If it is unwritten, then we just say, sorry, this section hasn't been written yet, and that's the end of the game. Now, of course, in the final product, there won't be any unwritten paragraphs, but annoyingly, we sort of, because we're going to be writing stuff and testing it a lot, we do have to have code for that eventuality, which presumably we might get rid of, or we might just keep it in there. It doesn't really do any harm being in there, I guess, once it's finished. But either way, if it's unwritten, then we just get a message saying, sorry, you've sort of run out of gamebook. Otherwise, all this happens. And what this is 2 main things. We print the text, if that is appropriate, which is that code, and then we do different things based on what sort of paragraph it is, which is all of the rest of the text on the page. So, printing the section text, we look at $S, $A, 0, and if it does not equal, that's what exclamation mark equals means, if it does not equal the string no text, then we print it. We print it plus 2 line breaks. So each section, if we go from one section to the next, they'll automatically be sort of divided into different paragraphs by having these line breaks there. And then, regardless of whether we've printed the text or not, we then have a series of if and then a series of else ifs. So if SA1 equals 0, then that happens. Else if it equals 1, else if it equals 2, else if it equals 3, and of course there'll be more of these as we continue through the story and as we add new mechanical things that need to happen. Sometimes, unfortunately, we'll have sort of one-off rules. Sometimes it'll be things that'll repeat, like testing your luck. That'll probably happen many times. and we'll have a section for that. But then other times there's like special things that you want to happen that particular mechanic is only this one section, and so you have to have a sort of special one-off section just for one paragraph, which is a bit annoying, but there's no way around it unless you don't have any unique mechanics, which, you know, you could do it, but it's unnecessarily restricting yourself, I feel. So what happens then depends on what the value of $S, $A1 is. So $S, $A0 is the text. $S, $A1 is the number that tells us what type of paragraph. If it equals 0, that's the game ending in a loss, and it just says you have lost. Presumably the text will be telling you how you've lost, where you fall into a pit and the pit's filled with spikes and the spikes pierce you and you die. And then it says you have lost. We might add a more fancy the end or something, or a logo or something at the end, but at the moment it's just that. If it equals 1, then that's just proceed to a new section. So we just set $A, which is the where you are, equal to $S A2, and then we include main. A lot of these are going to end with include main. This one doesn't, because it's the end of the game. But usually we'll alter some attributes, we'll alter some variables, which might include attributes, sorry. We'll alter some variables, certainly including $A, and then we'll include main. That'll be mostly how this works. It'll be change whatever sort of numbers need to change whatever variables need to change, then set A to a new value, and then include main. This is an exception. It's the one where the player has a choice. We have a loop, a for loop, which goes from 1 to $S A2. So $S A1 is 2, which tells us it's a choice. The next number tells us how many choices there are. So for example, in the one that we saw at the beginning of the story, where we can reveal ourselves or hide, we have the text, which is currently in brackets because it's a note. We have 2, that tells us it's a choice. We have another 2, that tells us there are 2 choices. And then for each choice, we have the text on the button and the destination. And note that, by the way, when we're dealing with numbers, we just have $S square bracket and the number and N square bracket. When we're dealing with something that's text or a mixture of text and numbers, we have to have these little sort of single quotes around it. We can't do that. That will generate an error. We have to have quotes like that. Okay. And then we have, the text and the destination for each choice. So let's get back to here, and we print this fairly complicated bit of text, which is a button. And I'll give you an example of what it might look like. We print button, quote, S $A Z times 2 plus 1. Z is the loop, the number, the variable that we're using in the loop. So it'll start at, this total will start at 3. 1 times 2 plus 1 is 3. And then the next time it'll be 5 and 7 and 9. If we had lots and lots of choices, it would keep going like that. So let's say, let's look at SA3 and say it'd be something like reveal yourself. It might be that. We have another quote there. The button always takes you to main. Then we have some code that's going to be inside the button. So we set $A equals, and this is very similar. It's $S, $A, Z times 2 plus 2. So it's the one that's after this one. It starts at 4, and then it goes 6, 8, 10, as high as necessary. So it might be set A equals 1B, something like that. And it'll be slash button. And it'll go through each choice and it'll... Oh, and also if Z is less than $SA2, in other words, if this isn't the final choice, then we put a couple of line breaks. So we might have something like that, and then we'd have stay hidden. And it would look very similar, except that the change to A, $A, would be different, because of course if you make a different choice, it should send you to a different paragraph. So therefore, it should set A to a different value. And if we only had those two choices, it wouldn't print the two line breaks for choice number 2. It would only do it for number 1. But if we had more choices, then it would keep doing it. It would keep printing those line breaks until we'd done the last option. Cast a spell, which is not very genre appropriate for this one, but could happen if we were doing a fantasy, and so on. That's what that does. Let me just get it back to normal. Oh, there we go. So that is if there's a player choice. This is a special one that's to do with the that respect variable. At the beginning of the game, if you end up talking to the hunter-gatherers, in your interactions with them, they will have a certain amount of respect for you, and that will have mechanical consequences. They're more likely to help you, basically. And it might come in later in the game. Perhaps you can call on their help in the final bit. I don't have a very solid idea of what the final act is going to be, so I can't say, but it would be very genre appropriate if you were able to call upon your savage allies and they would sort of come and win the battle for you or something. But it certainly will be important in the beginning, and I've decided to store that variable in $H. So we just have a little note in initialize every time. It doesn't start with any value. Where is H? I should have a little note anyway. Oh yes, here we go. $H, hunter-gatherer's respect for you. Higher numbers are better. Yeah. If I have a variable that doesn't have an initial value, I just put a little note like that so that all of the variables are listed in initialize. And therefore, if I want to put in a new variable, if I'm unsure of whether I've used that one before, I can go, well, is there an H? Oh yeah, there is. H is this one. And I know not to use it again and therefore cause confusion. So, if we're going to have a number that sets the hunter-gatherer's respect for us to a certain value, obviously we need to have code to make that happen, and that's what choice 3 is. So we set H equal to whatever number is here, and then we set A equal to whatever's in there. So these ones sort of automatically go. Most of the options where it's do some mechanical thing with the variable, most of those will then have a single destination. So it'll be like add 40 a stamina and then go to a certain paragraph. So we set H equal to whatever is in slot 2 of the relevant part of the S array. We set A equal to whatever's in slot 3, and then we just, as we're going to be doing with most of these, we include main. Which means, of course, we go back to the top of the page and then we print the text if it's not unwritten, and then we proceed based on $S $A1, but of course A is a new value now, so we'll be looking at new information. Now, as I look at this, I realise that it would probably make more sense to have an option to change. What I've done here is I've coded setting the value of h to a particular value, it might make more sense to have one that just adds or subtracts to it. But anyway, that's what I've done. Often as I look at this, I kind of realise there's better ways to do it. But let me finally show you how the game knows when to start telling you the respect that the hunter-gatherers have for you. Well, and that is in story caption. So it's fairly straightforward. It's a quite long page, but HTML tables are quite long. They're less complicated than they look. We have the logo, and then we have this if c equals 1. C is the variable that says basically start displaying the character in the sidebar, and it's sort of activated when C is set to 1 when you decide to continue after reading the introduction to your character. So all of this down to the bottom of the page is within that if. All of this only happens if C is equal to 1. And within that, it prints a HTML table and prints the attributes on different rows. So within that, I've put a new bit of code. I've shown you all that previous stuff. We've got a new bit of code which, again, is within an if. It says if $h. So if the attribute $h has a value at all, because every attribute has a value of undefined. Well, if it has a value that's not undefined, if it has a defined value. Because in Twine, every variable has a value of undefined until it's given another value. In a lot of languages, variables will have a value of 0, or at least in some languages. In some languages, if you try to talk about a variable and you haven't given it a value, that generates an error and stops the program. In Twine, it doesn't generate an error, but it has a value of undefined. So if you assume that it should be 0, but you haven't actually defined it as being 0, because you're used to sort of how other languages work, you'll get sort of weird results or errors. But if h is defined, and h is only ever defined, so far, it's only ever defined if $s$a1 is equal to 3. This is the only place that assigns any value to h. Now that I think about it, I realise actually we can't. I thought it would be easier to start h at 0 and then have a command that adds it and subtracts it. But I think I'm going to have to do both, because we don't want it to start at 0, because then that would mean that this activates at the wrong time. So I'm sorry about that. I said the wrong thing. It does have to start as undefined, and we're probably going to have a different command, a different option in main that is adding or subtracting to the respect. So if h equals 1, then it just makes a new row in the table that it's printing. So it prints a row. It has a cell with respect. It has a gap cell. This is basically the same format as what we're doing with the attributes. It has a colon. It has another column that's just a sort of 5-pixel gap to space things out a bit. And then it prints the value of h. And that is how, because it's within that if $h, that means that it will only happen once h has a value, which is once you meet the alien hunter-gatherers. And of course, when I write the full text, I will have some sort of note that says the hunter-gatherer's respect for you is kept. That will be kept track of with a number which will be on the sidebar or something like that, just to let the player know what this new respect thing is. I mean, they'll probably work it out, but just to let them know that it represents the hunter-gatherer's respect for you, I guess. In a game book, it would tell you, okay, so write down respect. This is a new stat that you've got to keep track of. I guess this is sort of the equivalent of that. So those are the changes that I've made. I've set up the structure that's going to allow us to write the game and later test it. I won't be doing any testing for quite a long time because it's only worth doing once we have a fairly extensive game. But we will be able to test it by using this array-based way of differentiating the different sections rather than having them as different pages. And I'll be, of course, writing more of the game and filling in the text, the bit that's, I'll probably write everything in brackets to start with, and then as the mood takes me, I'll start writing the exact wording of how it will look in the final game. So, as always, any feedback is very welcome. I hope that I'm I hope I'm explaining this clearly. Let me know if I'm sort of being too obscure, but on the contrary, let me know if I'm over-explaining, if I'm kind of, I don't know, repeating myself too much or sort of going into too much detail when you sort of understand what I'm saying already, and then I kind of keep going too much and you sort of, and I'll, if I get consistent feedback, I'll try and change the way it works. But for now, I hope that was useful or interesting for at least some of you, and I hope you will tune in next time.